Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. Today, we are looking at a fairly lackluster weekend at the box office. There was a movie that did fairly well. There was a movie that didn't do so well. We're going to talk about Old, Snake Eyes, M. Night Shyamalan, Space Jam, Black Widow, specialty box office. Lots of great stuff to cover. Let's jump right into it with a look at the top 5 box office movies of this past weekend, and we're going to take them kind of one by one here. Let's start with the number one film, which was M. Night Shyamalan's Old. It was kind of a toss-up going into the weekend. People weren't really sure which one was going to be on top, Snake Eyes or Old. It ended up being Old by a fairly comfortable margin, $16.8 million for M. Night Shyamalan's latest film. It was not critically well received. It wasn't particularly well received by audiences. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But it is a number one opening for M. Night Shyamalan, and there was some info going around this weekend. Somebody on Twitter kind of looped me into this thread on Reddit that was saying that M. Night Shyamalan was one of 4 or 5 filmmakers now that has a number one opening movie across 4 different decades. And that information even was fact-checked by people that were kind of going through, because they named a few. Steven Spielberg is one of them. Tim Burton is one of them. And there were other people that were adding like, well, Ron Howard could also belong to this club. The issue is that box office data only goes back so long with accuracy, as far as knowing this is how much a movie pulled in on a particular weekend. This was the number one movie of the weekend. So in actuality, there are probably several filmmakers that have had a number one opening film that was the most attended film in its opening weekend across 4 different decades. You could even go back to somebody like Alfred Hitchcock, perhaps, or even Cecil B. DeMille. We just don't have that information going back much past the early 1980s. It isn't a lot. It's not a frequent occurrence, so some credit has to be given where it's due. The fact that M. Night Shyamalan now in the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and the 2020s has made a film that's opened at number one at the box office. So let's take this moment and just celebrate that fact a little bit. Look back at M. Night Shyamalan's career. It's been a while since we just kind of did a retrospective, but let's go back through these past 4 decades, although it's kind of the very end of the 90s and the very beginning of this one. So it's closer to 20 years, but technically 4 different decades. And look at M. Night's history. First of all, these are his top 5 opening films. Number 1 is Signs, back in the summer of 2002 with $60 million, followed by The Village with $50 million. And then we have 3 that are just smushed together here. Glass at number 3 with $40.3 million. The Last Airbender, literally $3,000 behind that at number 4. And Split, a few $100,000 behind that at number 5. So when you look in the record books, those are officially the top 5 M. Night Shyamalan openings domestically. However, you know this show. You know what we do on this show. We're not just going to leave it at that. We're going to do everybody's favorite game. Say it with me. Adjusting for inflation. So let's look at M. Night Shyamalan's top 5 openings when you adjust for inflation, and that's especially good to do when you're looking back over a long period of time, 20 plus years, as we're doing now. And the number one movie remains the same, but if you were to adjust for today's dollars, Signs is number 1 by an even bigger margin with $93.2 million. It was a very successful film when it was released. The Village is still number 2 at $73.6 million, but then 2000's Unbreakable gets bumped up to number 3 at just over $50 million. 1999's The Sixth Sense at number 4 with $47 million, and then The Last Airbender still stays on the list at number 5 with $46 million. So this is maybe a better look, at least as far as the opening weekends go, at anticipation for M. Night Shyamalan's movies. Of course, his big breakout was with The Sixth Sense back in 1999. A little bit front-loaded. You're looking at a big kind of early 2000s rush for M. Night, but still consistently making films, making interesting films. In my review of Old, it wasn't a movie that I particularly enjoyed, but one thing I said about M. Night Shyamalan is he is, no matter what you think of his films, very rarely a director that makes an uninteresting movie, even if it's interesting for all the wrong reasons. So, a lot of people are saying like, well, it's a pandemic. Well, would it have been number 1? Well, we don't know. We don't know the answers to those questions, so we can't really put an actual asterisk on this. It is a number 1 opening movie for M. Night Shyamalan. Let's take a look at the number 2 opening movie, and that's Snake Eyes G.I. Joe Origins with $13.3 million. And this is where I think it's important as I kind of try to conduct my box officeology classes here. A lot of people would say like, oh, well, Old and Snake Eyes, they did about the same. There was only $3 million separating them. Well, yeah, if you just look at the raw numbers, but something very important to keep in mind. Old had a budget at around reported reportedly $18 million. So a $16+ million opening for that movie, not too bad. That means that Old is going to be seeing some of its money back once you loop in the rest of its run domestically, the worldwide numbers, all of the numbers that come in from, video on demand and home video release, etc. That's all going to be probably a cash flow positive movie. Snake Eyes G.I. Joe Origins, yes, it did $3 million less, but it cost $88 million to make that movie. So it was a $70 million more expensive movie than Old. And that's why it's important to point these things out, because some people would look at that and say like, well, these box office analysts, they're not very fair. They say that Old did really good and Snake Eyes didn't do great, but there was only $3 million separating them. Well, that's because Snake Eyes cost $70 million more. And I'm sure that Paramount would have preferred a much better result for that movie. They're looking to launch a whole G.I. Joe universe. And as we talked about last week, you have to apply pandemic rules, COVID rules, equally to every movie, because some people say like, well, the turnout was depressed by COVID and everything else. Well, we have seen that if there is an energized enough crowd that really wants to go see a movie, they will turn out for that opening weekend. Maybe not weekend 2 or weekend 3, but they will turn out for that opening weekend. Now, there are concerns, yes, about the resurgence here. Perhaps that depressed turnout just a little bit. But I think it's more of a case of people maybe just weren't that excited about this movie. It was not, again, very critically well received. The word of mouth wasn't very good on it. So I don't think that you can blame the current circumstance for what Snake Eyes did here. I think it's more looking at the movie, were people excited by it, and the end product just wasn't something that got a whole lot of people going. So if you're Paramount, you're obviously going to be looking to what international numbers you can get. It didn't do particularly well in the international market this weekend in the markets that it opened, although there are still some markets left for it to open in. CinemaScore does not bode well for either of these films. Now, it's not the be-all, end-all, but it does measure what opening night crowds thought compared to what they were hoping for, what they were expecting from these movies. C+ for Old, a B- for Snake Eyes. Not a good result for either movie, so we shouldn't look at word of mouth to really boost these movies a lot going forward. But in the case of 1 versus 2, Old coming out with a much more clear win based on its lower cost of production. Looking at number 3, we have Black Widow, which dropped about 55% in its third weekend. So after a big drop last week, we have another 50% plus drop there. We talked about all the reasons possibly behind this drop. They did not really arrest that momentum there as far as the downward momentum for Black Widow, although it is at number 3. Last week's number 1 movie dropped below it, and Disney is not really holding out a whole lot of hope for the rest of the theatrical window, at least not domestically, for Black Widow, because it was announced today that it will be hitting digital in just 2 weeks. So in its 5th week in theaters, basically, after 5 weeks, it's going to be available on digital. Physical copies of the movie follow on September 14th, so about a month layoff from there, and then on October 6th, reportedly, all Disney Plus subscribers will get access to Black Widow. So even Disney, who had not committed to this really actually abbreviated theatrical window other than putting things simultaneously on Disney Plus, is only going to wait out 5 weeks before they put Black Widow out on digital for people to watch at home. And keep in mind that we don't even have a release date yet for it in some major markets, which is something we're going to talk about related to our number 4 movie, which was Space Jam. Space Jam continues this trend we talked about it last week of a very energized audience showing up on week 1 and then a plummet in week 2, because Space Jam fell 69% in its second week. That was actually the biggest drop of any movie that I could find on the box office chart, not just wide release, any releases, any tracked releases. Space Jam fell off the most from last week, and that tracks with what we've seen, this big fall off as the number of people that want to go to the theaters to see it are largely just in that first weekend. Obviously, a lot of other folks choosing to either not watch the movie due to word of mouth or watch it at home on HBO Max. Certainly not a lot of repeat business, because I'm guessing if people want to watch the movie again, they're going to be watching it on HBO Max. But something related to both Space Jam and Black Widow that I wanted to mention. And again, people loop me into these things on social media. This was a conversation that I got notified of on Twitter, which is that particularly this last week, there was a lot of traction around a storyline that Space Jam had been blocked in China. Some people were saying that Space Jam had been banned in China. Some people saying that Space Jam had been denied a release date in China. And these were largely politically motivated people or politically motivated opinionated sites, particularly around LeBron James, that kind of wanted to bring up this idea that the movie was already a failure in China. Something to clarify here, though, which is that Space Jam has not been denied a release date in the sense that China has said you cannot come out in China, nor has it been blocked or banned in the country. Space Jam and Black Widow are actually in the same situation, which is that we are in the middle of an annual blackout period in China. It generally lasts for the duration of July. This has affected movies like Spider-Man Homecoming in the past before. China prioritizes domestic films, Chinese films, generally during the month of July. This is kind of an unofficial, official thing, and that's what we're seeing right now. That's why we're seeing so many high-profile Chinese releases. We're going to see a few of them here in a couple minutes. That's just what China likes to do in the month of July. There's speculation this year that because of the recovery, etc., and the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party in China, that this may extend into August. There's no set date, but what we have here is Black Widow and Space Jam both sort of in line to get a release date in China, and they have not yet been informed when that is going to be. Now, that's certainly not an ideal situation, but it's also not something unusual, nor is it targeted toward one or two particular films. This is just the situation that Hollywood movies are finding themselves in as China prioritizes their own film industry over Hollywood. So a lot of times when you see these stories, they have a kernel of truth, but they also have a little bit of a spin on them. And the spin that I saw, particularly with Space Jam, is that this should somehow be seen as a personal insult to LeBron or a reflection of his own personal politics, etc. That's not what we're seeing with China, at least not so far. They've made no indication of that. What we are seeing is the same thing that we see every year, which is a very opaque process of when they decide to release films, Hollywood films in China during this blackout period and immediately following. It wouldn't be unusual for China to announce tomorrow that Black Widow comes out in China a week from now. That's just the way it works a lot of times. It's not this thing where there's the release date set 3 months ahead of time and you know what it's going to be. Coming out of this blackout period, we could know any day that the movie's going to come out in a week or 2 weeks, but we don't know when that's going to be. So just something to keep in mind when we talk about Black Widow and Space Jam. Now, if for some reason China does decide not to show these movies at all, then that is a big story. We're just not at that point yet. And there's some people out there that are claiming that we are at that point. That's not where we are in the life cycle of this movie right now. For the past several weeks, I've been doing a weekend tracker just to see how this summer box office season is comparing to the last few. 2020 is, as we've said, just a flat line there as a basis for comparison. And what we've been seeing is that generally this summer is following the same pattern as previous summers, just to a smaller degree. We had a big variation, however, this weekend. If we look at this chart, this past weekend, the 12th weekend of the summer, you see this huge spike in 2019. That is the debut of the remake of The Lion King, which had a debut weekend of almost $200 million in and of itself. So that's why you see that huge spike in 2019. If we look over at 2018, though, 2021 does continue to basically follow the same pattern as summer of 2018 with a small decline there, but you still see that huge gulf between summer 2021 and summer of 2018. So, 2019 with The Lion King, obviously a huge debut there, but still the trend remains that we are seeing a typical ebb and flow of a summer season, just with far fewer people actually going to the theaters. So I will continue to track that as we head into weekend 13 of the summer. Now, these are not analogous as far as like the third weekend of July matches up with the third weekend of July because there's some variance in the calendar dates, but I will continue to track that as we go through the summer and see what it looks like at the end. Let's look at the top per theater average, and this one was kind of a latecomer. This movie came in later today. The gross wasn't reported until this afternoon, but the top grossing film in theaters was a documentary distributed by Neon called Ailey, which is about the legendary African-American dancer and choreographer Alvin Ailey. As I mentioned, distributed by Neon, just in a couple theaters, $7,500. And we see that a lot of times, especially if we have a wide release or two that's not really lighting the world on fire any time of year. Let's look at the top 5 specialty box office or limited release films that are in 1,000 or fewer theaters. And number one for a second week is the documentary Roadrunner, a film about Anthony Bourdain. It drops under $1 million, but still maintains the number one spot in 954 theaters, so just under that 1,000 theater threshold. Pig remains the number 2 film for the second week in 588 theaters with almost $600,000. The documentary Summer of Soul is on the chart for the 4th consecutive weeks. Like I say, very impressive considering it's also available on streaming with over $100,000. At number 4 is another film whose gross came in later this afternoon, Cat Video Fest 2021 in 38 theaters with just over $40,000. This is an annual event. It's a compilation of cat videos. A portion of the proceeds goes to support animal shelters and animal welfare and protection programs. So that's a big highlight for a lot of folks every year. And then at number 5 in 32 theaters with $35,000 is a movie called Once I Was Engaged, which is a sequel to a film called Once I Was a Beehive. This is geared largely toward an audience involved with the LDS Church. And so this movie opened in theaters across Utah, obviously a huge LDS population in Utah. It will expand to further theaters in the coming weeks, but that is good enough to reach number 5 on the limited release chart. Let's take a look internationally and see what the box office was like outside of the US and Canada. So these are all of the marketplaces outside of the domestic marketplace. White Snake 2 Green Snake is the top grossing international film. This is just the Chinese gross. This is a sequel to the 2019 Chinese animated film White Snake, which is based on Chinese fables. At number 2 internationally, another Chinese film, The Chinese Doctors, with $17.3 million. Again, this is solely a gross from the Chinese market. Black Widow, the number 3 grossing international film, followed by Space Jam: A New Legacy, and F9, which continues to perform well overseas. So let's take the international market, combine it with the domestic market, and see what the top 5 movies worldwide were this past weekend. And White Snake 2, even when you combine Black Widow's domestic gross, is still the top grossing movie worldwide just based on the strength of its Chinese opening. At number 1, Black Widow at number 2 with $26.1 million, followed by Old with just over $23 million, Space Jam: A New Legacy at $22.1 million, and Chinese Doctors at number 5. So 2 Chinese films in the Chinese market exclusively, bracketing worldwide grosses from 2 studio films coming here from the United States. Looking at the 2021 domestic summer box office, we had a big change this past week. F9 has captured the top spot. It is now the top grossing movie of summer 2021. It bumps A Quiet Place Part 2 off of its perch. Now the question is going to be, will Black Widow take that spot? It's very possible. It's only $9 million behind, but the wrinkle in all of this is the availability of Black Widow on digital in just 2 weeks. Whatever legs it might have had are going to be curtailed at least a little bit by that. So this is going to be a much closer contest than I think even I had ever anticipated. But currently Black Widow is at number 3. It's sure to take that number 2 spot. And now the question is, will it be able to inch out F9 and stay at number 1 for part or all of the rest of the summer? Cruella stays at number 4. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It at 5. Space Jam: A New Legacy moves up 4 spots from last week to number 6. The Boss Baby Family Business drops down 1 spot. The Forever Purge moves up 1. Peter Rabbit 2, The Runaway, and The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard both dropping down 2 spots to numbers 9 and 10. When we compare this with my predictions for the summer, not much change from last week. Black Widow was my number 1 prediction. It's still currently ranked number 3. F9 I predicted at number 4. It's currently ranked number 1, and A Quiet Place Part 2, which I predicted to be the 6th highest grossing film of the summer, is ranked number 2. So obvious underestimation on my part for both F9 and A Quiet Place Part 2. In the Heights, eliminated from competition, bad call on my part. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, I had it predicted as the number 9 movie of the summer. It's currently ranked number 5, although if some of these movies end up moving over it, then it looks like that might have been my most accurate pick. We'll see what happens with Black Widow, but a lot of movies have yet to be released, although one of them, Jungle Cruise, which I added to my top 10 list after Hotel Transylvania 3 was pushed out of the summer 2021 box office picture. That comes out this weekend, so we're going to see what happens with Jungle Cruise, the latest big release from Disney. Looking at the 2021 domestic chart, not a whole lot changed, except for, again, much like the summer chart, because summer has been really driving the 2021 domestic box office, no pun intended. F9 is now the number 1 film of the year domestically at number 1. It bumps A Quiet Place Part 2 down to number 2. And Space Jam: A New Legacy joins the list at number 8. The Boss Baby Family Business moves up one spot to number 9. And then now hanging on in the 10th spot is Demon Slayer the movie. It drops down 2 slots to number 10. And Space Jam: A New Legacy bumps out Tom and Jerry, another animated film from Warner Brothers this year. It is now out of the 2021 domestic top 10. Looking at the worldwide picture for 2021, again, not a whole lot has changed here. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, and Cliff Walkers switch places at numbers 8 and 9, and then Chinese Doctors bumps out A Writer's Odyssey, which is another Chinese film. So what we have now is 2 Chinese films at the top of the list, Hi Mom and Detective Chinatown 3, although F9, if it can get to that $700 million mark, will then become the number 2 film of the year. But 2 Chinese films bracketing 6 studio releases at numbers 1 and 2 and 9 and 10 for China there. So we will continue to see if there's other movies that are going to break into this worldwide picture. But as was the case last year, of course, it was radically different last year, but China dominating the global box office, the worldwide box office so far this year. This was a chart that I forgot to do last week. I just completely overlooked it, and many of you noticed, but it's also one that is slowly becoming less and less relevant. This is the top 10 films over the last 365 days. And again, as with all the other charts, F9 is now the highest grossing film for the past 365 days domestically. It drops A Quiet Place Part 2 down to number 2. And we still have the same 2 films from 2020 that are the only 2 films remaining on this chart, The Croods: A New Age and Tenet. We see now that Tenet is up to 327 days, so it is 38 days shy of being on this chart for 365 full days. I don't know if it's going to make it. That's $58 million. Are 2 movies going to surpass that total? It looks like Space Jam: A New Legacy, even though it's fading quickly, very well may do that. And so really that leaves a very small margin for Tenet to continue to stay on this list. And once Croods: A New Age and Tenet are both bumped off this list, then it really just becomes a top 10 highest grossing movies of 2021 list. So we'll revisit what we do with the list when and if that happens. Demon Slayer the movie drops out of the highest grossing films from the previous 365 days with the entry of Space Jam: A New Legacy onto this chart. Before we look at what people are watching at home with streaming, let's do a flashback to a weekend of summers past. And this year we're going back to 1997 when we inaugurated what many consider to be the best movie president of all time, Air Force One. In its first week in 1997 opened to $37 million at the box office. That number, of course, would be a lot higher if we adjusted this chart for inflation. This was a big hit in the late summer of 97. It topped week 2 of the Brendan Fraser live-action George of the Jungle adaptation for Disney. In week 4, Men in Black stayed in the top 5. It was at number 3. In its third week, Robert Zemeckis' Contact was at number 4, and then opening against Air Force One and coming into the top 5 was Good Burger, the Nickelodeon film starring Kenan and Kel. Kenan Thompson still in the sketch comedy game almost 25 years later. That is longevity in this business, ladies and gentlemen. But Good Burger in the top 5 this weekend 24 years ago. As we always do, let's wrap out with what people are watching at home, and let's start with the top 10 most rented/bought movies on Amazon. This does not include movies that are just for streaming, so no Amazon originals. And the number 1 movie is The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard. The purchase window for that film opened, and so that was the most purchased movie on Amazon this past week. The Forever Purge, the premium video on demand window, is open for that. That's part of the new agreement with Universal to have their movies in theaters for about a month, so it's there at number 2. Wrath of Man at number 3. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, the rental window has opened for that, so 4K rental at number 4. A Quiet Place Part 2, The Purchase at number 5. Spiral from the Book of Saw and Nobody at number 7. The HD rental for The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It at number 8. Zola, which was another movie that was in theaters fairly recently, is now in the premium video on demand window, so it's at number 9. And Jackass the movie. I guess people saw that Jackass Forever trailer and decided that they wanted to revisit the original, is at number 10 on Amazon. Looking at what people are watching through iTunes, and the number 1 film there is also The Hitman's Wife's Bodyguard at number 1. Wrath of Man is at number 2. At number 3 is a movie called Midnight in the Switchgrass. This is Megan Fox's second VOD film this month. This is Bruce Willis's second movie this year. It is about a Texas serial killer, although I believe the movie actually is rewritten to take place in Florida. But that is the number 3 movie. At number 4 is The Vault. It's a movie that stars Freddie Highmore, and it was available as a 99-cent rental, so that's probably why it is that high. No offense to Freddie Highmore, but it's a great deal. A Quiet Place Part 2 at number 5. The purchase window is still open for that. Nobody at number 6, and then 4 new entries to round out the chart. The premium video on-demand window for The Forever Purge brings it to number 7. Resurgence is at number 8. That is a documentary about the 2020 CrossFit Games, so a lot of people buying that documentary to watch on iTunes. At number 9 is a film called Settlers, which is a new sci-fi film set on Mars starring Sofia Boutella. And then at number 10, Spiral from the Book of Saw re-enters the chart in its buy-rent availability window. Now we turn to Netflix to see what people are watching on the streaming service. And first of all, we look at Netflix overall. So this is inclusive of everything that you could watch over on Netflix. And at number 1 is Blood Red Sky, which is a Netflix original movie. This is a mid-air vampire action drama. It's a co-production from the UK and Germany. That takes the number 1 spot. Virgin River, the Netflix original series, is at number 2. Manifest, Never Have I Ever, and Twilight are all holdovers from last week. At number 6 is Kevin Smith's Masters of the Universe Revelation, a follow-up to the 1980s animated series. I'm actually still in the middle of watching this. There was a lot of conversation generated about the show that I just don't really feel like wading into, to be quite honest. And the fact that I just haven't really finished the show yet. I'm just a couple episodes in, but that's at number 6 on Netflix. At number 7 is a Netflix original movie called The Last Letter from Your Lover. This is a British film from director Augustine Frizzell. She did a sort of coming-of-age movie a few years ago called Never Going Back. This one stars Felicity Jones, Shailene Woodley, and Callum Turner. At number 8, because it can never be extinguished from this list, is Cocomelon. I saw some people that were telling me over the week that Twilight had bumped Cocomelon off the list. They're like, Cocomelon's gone. Well, no, Cocomelon will never be gone. It will always be there. It will be on this list until the sun burns out and the earth is a dying husk. The last survivors on Earth will be watching Cocomelon on Netflix. It remains number 8 on the Netflix list. Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2 is at number 9, and Twilight New Moon is at number 10. And looking at just what people are watching on the movie side of Netflix, Blood Red Sky, Twilight, and The Last Letter from Your Lover are at numbers 1, 2, and 3. Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2 and Twilight New Moon are at 4 and 5. Twilight Eclipse and Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 1 are at numbers 6 and 7. Then we have 2 new entries into the list. We have Troll Hunters, Rise of the Titans. This is the concluding chapter of Guillermo del Toro's Troll Hunters franchise. He co-wrote the screenplay for this one. And then Kingdom, Ashin of the North, which is actually a standalone movie from a South Korean TV show called Kingdom, which is also streaming on Netflix in the United States. So if you want to see the whole story, you can get both this standalone movie and also the TV series that it's based on Netflix. And then at number 10, a movie that debuted on Netflix last week, Gunpowder Milkshake, rounding out the top 10. And that does it for charts this week. Looking at the weekend coming up, the big movie is Disney's Jungle Cruise. I will have a review for Jungle Cruise tomorrow right here on the channel when the embargo drops, so keep an eye out for that. 2 other notable films that are being released in a smaller number of theaters are David Lowery's The Green Knight, which is something that a lot of people have been looking forward to. It was pushed from last year. It's finally coming out in theaters here domestically this weekend. And then Tom McCarthy's new film Stillwater, starring Matt Damon, which has some award aspirations, will also be opening in theaters along with a handful of other films. So check that out. There are definitely some new entries out there for people that want to head to the theaters if you can do so safely. One programming note, next week's charts will be a little different because I'm actually going to be producing it from the road. I'm taking a trip to Los Angeles this weekend to battle Ethan Irwin to defend my singles championship belt in the Movie Trivia Schmodown. That match will be taking place on Sunday, so next Monday I will be doing the show remotely, but don't worry, we'll still be doing charts. We'll be talking about Jungle Cruise. It may just look and feel a little bit different, so stay tuned for that. Also, if you want to see a lot of other stuff I'm doing, you can check me out as always on Patreon. Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. And I want to particularly thank some of these patrons. These are some of my producer level patrons. They're the top tier over on Patreon. They help keep me in shape for the Schmodown. We have monthly study sessions. We also do movie commentaries, AMAs, watch-alongs, some really fun stuff. And I'd love for you to come and join and be a part of that community. But also thank you for watching this video. Please like, share, subscribe, do all the great YouTube things. It helps the channel grow as we approach 100,000 subscribers, hopefully very soon. Thank you so much. If you are heading out into the theaters or really just into the world in general, please take the proper precautions and stay safe. And I'll see you next time. Bye.